One winter, Willie took a cook's tour to Hawaii. When he came back, he told the fireman he had joined an organization which for $5 gave its subscribers a closer view of the volcanoes than the ordinary tourist could get. Willie was crazy about the volcanoes. His trip, however, was spoiled, it came out, because someone recognized and pointed him out as the famous Willie Stevens of the Hall Mills case. He had the cook's agent cancel a month's reservation at a hotel and rearrange his schedule so that he could leave on the next ship. He is infuriated by any reference to the murders or to the trial. Some years ago, a newspaper printed a paragraph about a man out west who was a perfect double for Willie Stevens. Someone in the firehouse showed it to Willie, and he tore the paper to shreds in a rage. Willie still spends a great deal of time reading heavy books on engineering, on entomology, on botany. Those who have seen his famous room at 23 Nicole Avenue, he has a friend in to visit him once in a while, say that it is filled with books. He has no use for detective stories or the Western and adventure magazines his friends the firemen read. When he is not reading scientific tomes, he dips into the classics or what he calls the worthwhile poets. He used to astound the firemen with his wide range of knowledge. There was the day a salesman of shaving materials dropped in at the engine house. Finding that Willie had visited St. Augustine, Florida, he mentioned an old Spanish chapel there. Willie described it and gave its history, replete with dates, and greatly impressed the caller. Another time, someone mentioned a certain kind of insect, which he said was found in this country. "You mean they used to be," said Willie. "That type of insect has been extinct in this country for 40 years. It turned out that it had been, too. On still another occasion, Willie fell to discussing flowers with some visitor at the firehouse, and reeled off a Latin designation, Crasinae carduaceae, or something of the sort. Then he turned, grinning, to the listening fireman. "Zinnias to you," he said. Willie Stevens' income from the trust fund established for him is said to be around $40 a week. His expenditures are few, now that he is no longer able to go on long trips. The firemen like especially to tell about the time that Willie went to Wyoming and attended a rodeo. He told the ticket seller he wanted to sit in a box, and the man gave him a single ticket. Willie explained that he wanted the whole box to himself, and he planked down a $10 bill for it. Then he went in and sat in the box all alone. "I had a hell of a time," he told the fireman gleefully when he came back home. DeRussey's Lane, which Detective David once pointed out to Willie Stevens, is now, you may have heard, entirely changed. Several years ago it was renamed Franklin Boulevard, and where the Reverend Mr. Edward W. Hall and Mrs. Eleanor Mills lay murdered, there is now a row of neat brick and stucco houses. The famous crab-apple tree under which the bodies were found disappeared the first weekend after the murders. It was hacked to pieces, roots and all, by souvenir hunters. Helpful Hints and the Hoveys. No sooner have I turned my back, a laborious and rather painful procedure for me nowadays, than some bright-eyed woman or other rises briskly from her escritoire with a brand-new list of 9 or 10 ways of preventing something or bringing something to pass. In a recent Sunday Times, Dr. Josephine Rathbone sets forth 10 tricks, she calls them, which will help you to relax and go to sleep. Trick number 1 goes like this. Cut down on the intensity of your thinking half an hour before retiring. Play Chinese checkers. Plan an excursion for the weekend. Write a letter to a friend. Think of pleasant things you have been doing. I lay awake for several hours one night pondering that suggestion. As I tossed and turned, I figured the effect that trick number 1 must have had on George Hovey, a nervous middle-aged insomniac I know. I am sure that George saw Dr. Rathbone's list. He never misses anything in the Sunday Times. I could see George and his wife Irma sitting in their living room at 10:30 on the evening of the Sunday Dr. Rathbone's list of tricks appeared. Irma, looking up from her mystery novel. "What are you doing now?" George, who has not moved or said a word for 10 minutes. "Oh, I am cutting down on the intensity of my thoughts." Irma, "Well, do you have to look that way?" George, "What way?" Irma, "As if you were crouched to spring." George, angrily, the intensity of his thoughts going way up. "Even if we had some Chinese checkers and I knew how to play, and so did you, I wouldn't play with you." Irma, "I didn't say anything about playing any Chinese checkers. George, "Let it go, will you? I mean, for the God's sake." Irma, Now don't start swearing at me. I can't say anything to you anymore but what you flare up. George. Shut up. Irma. You shut up. George. You shut up too. Irma. Shut up. Irma goes back to her book, and George closes his eyes and tries to relax. 10 minutes go by. Irma. You're tightening up again. I can feel it. George. I can't think of anything pleasant that's happened to me recently. Irma. Well, who can? George. I'll either have to write to a friend or plan a weekend excursion. Irma. Don't be nasty. I don't care if you do. You haven't got any friends. George. Is that so? All yours are ones you met through me. Irma. That's such a lie, I won't even answer it. Are you trying to make me mad? George, shouting. You said I didn't have any friends. Irma, yelling. I mean to write letters to. All your friends are in town. You see them every day. George. I don't have to send the letter, do I? Irma coldly refuses to answer this idiotic question and goes back to her book. 2 minutes pass. Irma. Where do you think you're going, if I may ask? George. I'm not going anywhere except to bed, if you will let me cut down on the intensity of my thoughts. Irma. You have to stay in town every weekend and work. George. I know that. Do you have to rub it in? Irma. You said you were going on a weekend excursion. George. I said I was planning one. Irma, yelling. If you are planning a weekend excursion, you are going somewhere. George, rising and pacing the floor. I am not. It's the way Josephine Rathbone gets to sleep. Irma. Oh, it is? Well, that's very interesting, I'm sure. And who is Josephine Radburn? George. I never heard of her. You can keep this going as long as you want to, but George has already fallen or been pushed into such a state that there will be no sleep for him this night. If you are interested in the good doctor's 8 other rules, I'm afraid you'll have to look them up in the Sunday Times. The only one that may be said to have fascinated me is number 7, which suggests you go to bed a little damp and chilly from your bath. So much for Dr. Rathbone. Now we come to Helen Haberman and her list of 9 ways to keep calm and thus avoid stomach disorders. This list was included in an article by Mrs. Haberman, which appeared in a recent issue of Cosmopolitan. Let us, before we print the 9 helpful hints, look in on the Hoveys again. It is a little past midnight, and Irma sits in the living room, glaring at George. The Hoveys have had 6 guests for dinner, all of whom have just left. Irma. Well, you certainly made a spectacle of yourself tonight. George. What did I do? Irma. What didn't you do? First you were dull, and you talked in such a low voice nobody could understand you. You just sat there like a bump on a log. Then you did everything so badly. You hacked up the roast, you slopped up the drinks, and you thought it was funny. Anyway, you tried to get people to laugh at you. George. Go on. That can't be all I did. Irma. Well, I should say it wasn't. You missed the point of all the stories everybody told. You acted as if you were listening with only one ear to what was being said. I don't know what they thought of you, but I'm sure they'll never come here again, any of them. George. What else did I do, pet? Irma. Don't call me pet. You were so selfish. You emptied your own ashtray from time to time, but you wouldn't empty old Dr. Townsend's, although it was right on the table next to you. George, I've never heard of any man acting like you did tonight. It was disgraceful. I was never so humiliated in my life. George. Are you finished now? Irma. I am not. You were as disagreeable as you could be to all the girls. No, you kept saying, no matter what they asked you, and you ended up growling and grumbling. What's got into you anyway, for the God's sake? George. I got to act that way. Irma. What do you mean you got to act that way? George. I got to do it to avoid stomach disorders. Here, read this. He hands her Mrs. Haberman's list of 9 ways to avoid worry and its resulting ailments. In case you, too, were puzzled by George's behavior as described by Mrs. Hovey, here are the helpful hints for a peaceful mind and a happy stomach, which George was dutifully following out. Be a little dull. A low voice and quiet manner may make you seem dull to some people, but risk it for the sake of harmony and ease. Do things badly. There's no harm in falling short of perfection the first time you try something new. The important thing is to want to do something ardently enough to risk doing it at all. Let people laugh at you. Keep your own sense of humor active, and it won't matter whether people laugh at you or with you. Be disagreeable. Say no often. Develop your own interests and stick to them stubbornly. Cultivate laziness. If you're a natural worrier, it goes without saying that you rush and bustle. Slow down. Miss the point occasionally. Don't always strain to get the other fellow's views. Don't always try to argue back. Deliberately listen with only one ear now and then. Practice selfishness. Do your own work first. Don't let others monopolize you. Be a bump on a log. It takes plenty of stolid sitting to withstand times of national stress like these. You needn't apologize for inaction. Growl and grumble. Don't keep your feelings bottled up. There's nothing like a good, healthy mad to relieve strained feelings. Mrs. Haberman, in her article, gives several case histories. The one that interests me most is as follows. Case B. An attractive young married woman has stomach attack every day. Does it occur at any particular hour, the doctor asks. Yes, every night at dinner. It develops that her mother-in-law, who lives with them, eats lunch in her room, but joins the family for dinner. Tell your husband to have his mother eat upstairs, the doctor advises. She makes the suggestion tactfully, the change is arranged, and her stomach doesn't bother her again. Let's see how the good doctor's advice would work out in actual practice. I take you again to the home of George Hovey, whose mother has been living with him and Irma for some months now. It is 5 p.m., and the Hoveys are alone in their living room, old Mrs. Hovey not having returned from a trip to the 6th Avenue shooting galleries. Irma. Sometimes I think your mother has the pleasantest room in the house. It would make a very cheerful dining room. George. Irma. I often go in there to eat when I'm here alone. I think a person eats more in a cheerful room like that. George. What are you talking about, Irma? Irma. I was just thinking that your mother would be happier if she ate dinner in her room. George. She eats her lunch there now, and I can't see that that makes her very happy. What does she eat her lunch in there for, anyway? Irma. Oh, she really loves eating in there, George. George. And you say you'd rather eat there than in any room in the house? Well, eat your lunch in there with Mama if you want to. I don't care. Irma, clutching at her stomach. You don't see what I mean, George. It's for your mother's sake, really. She eats so little at dinner that it gives me stomach trouble. Then that worries her. George. I don't see how it could. Mama was telling me the other day that you have stomach trouble because you stuff yourself. Irma. Indeed. George. How could her eating so little affect your stomach, for the God's sake? Irma, yelling. Everything she does affects my stomach. I can't bear the sight of her sitting there. She eats as if she were chewing dice. George. Is that so? At least she is a lady and she went to school, which is more than you can say about your mother. And so it goes. Each time I try to write a scene in which Irma tactfully gets George to make Mama eat dinner in her room, the Hoveys end up screaming and blaspheming. Perhaps one of you ladies will sit down and write out a list of 9 or 10 ways of persuading a husband to keep his mother out of the dining room. It's too much for me. Memorial. She came all the way from Illinois by train in a big wooden crate 13 years ago, a frightened black poodle not yet a year old. She felt terrible in body and worse in mind. These contraptions that men put on wheels, in contravention of that law of nature which holds that the feet must come in contact with the ground in traveling, dismayed her. She was never able to ride 1,000 yards in an automobile without getting sick at her stomach, but she was always apologetic about this frailty, never, as she might well have been, reproachful. She tried patiently at all times to understand man's way of life, the rolling of his wheels, the raising of his voice, the ringing of his bells, his way of searching out with lights the dark protecting corners of the night, his habit of building his beds inside walls, high above the nurturing earth. She refused with all courtesy to accept his silly notion that it is better to bear puppies in a place made of machined wood and clean blue cloth than in the dark and warm dirt beneath the oak flooring of the barn. The poodle was hand in glove with natural phenomena. She raised 2 litters of puppies, 11 each time, taking them in her stride the way she took the lightning and the snow. One of these litters, which arrived ahead of schedule, was discovered under the barn floor by a little girl of 4. The child gaily displayed on her right forearm the almost invisible and entirely painless marks of teeth which had gently induced her to put down the live black toys she had found and wanted to play with. The poodle had no vices that I can think of, unless you could count her incurable appetite for the tender tips of the young asparagus in the garden, and for the black raspberries when they ripened on the bushes in the orchard. Sometimes, as punishment for her depredations, she walked into bees' nests or got her long, shaggy ears tangled in fence wire. She never snarled about the penalties of existence or whimpered about the trials and grotesqueries of life with man. She accepted gracefully the indignities of the clipping machine, which in her maiden days periodically made a clown of her for the dog shows, in accordance with the stupid and unimaginative notion inherited from the drunken Romans that this most sensitive and dignified of animals is at heart a fool. The poodle, which can look as husky as a Briere when left shaggy, is an outdoors dog and can hold its own in the field with the best of the retrievers, including the Labrador. The poodle won a great many ribbons in her bench days, and once went best of breed at Madison Square Garden, but she would have traded all her medals for a dish of asparagus. She knew it was show time when a red rubber bib was tied around her neck. That meant a ride in a car. I used to ride with her in the rumble seat, and once on our way to Newport, when the rain came down suddenly, there was I with one hand on the poodle's shoulder and the other holding over her a bright green parasol. The highways of New England have, I am sure, seldom beheld a more remarkable sight. Like the great Gemeyer of Tarkington's Gentle Julia, the poodle I knew seemed sometimes about to bridge the mysterious and conceivably narrow gap that separates instinct from reason. She could take part in your gaiety and your sorrow. She trembled to your uncertainties and lifted her head at your assurances. There were times when she seemed to come close to a pitying comprehension of the whole troubled scene and what lies ticking behind it. If poodles who walk so easily upon their hind legs ever do learn the little tricks of speech and reason, I should not be surprised if they made a better job of it than man, who would seem to be slowly slipping back to all fours, in spite of Van Wyck Brooks and Lewis Mumford and Robert Frost. The poodle kept her sight, her hearing, and her figure up to her quiet and dignified end. She knew that the hand was upon her, and she accepted it with a grave and unapprehensive resignation. This, her dark, intelligent eyes seemed to be trying to tell me, is simply the closing of full circle. This is the flower that grows out of beginning. This, not to make it too hard for you, friend, is as natural as eating the raspberries and raising the puppies and riding into the rain. Part 2. Forward. The stories that follow were written in Europe, most of them in France, in 1937 and 1938. So far away, so long ago. Since France, whenever I was there, made my heart a lighted place, these small random essays are neither searching nor troubled. Everyone in those ending years of an epoch must have had some sense of the dreadful shadow ahead. There were so many signs and intimations. I left the examination and report of all this to those better equipped for such a task, and set out to drive the long, straight, quiet roads of France, and to walk the old familiar streets of favorite towns. These are merely pieces of the color and pattern of the surface, which is to me the loveliest in the world. Anything written about France out of lightness of heart must seem now a little melancholy and incongruous. My hope in reprinting these stories is that they may start up some bright, cherished memory of the France which so many of us will always love, the France which we know will rise again. You know how the French are. It is touch and go, il s'en faut de bien peu, which is harder for an American in Europe to understand. The report of a cricket match in the Daily Mail, or an account anywhere of what is going on in French political circles. On my 2 previous visits to France, I never came close to understanding what was going on in French political circles. Cricket I gave up long ago. So this time, before I sailed, I decided to buy some helpful books on the subject to read on the voyage over. I got Alexander Worth's Which Way France, in spite of a title that sounded as if Mr. Worth wasn't very sure of what was going on himself, Mr. Gunther's Inside Europe, which has several chapters on France, and a book on government by Monsieur Léon Blum, written in French. This last, since I couldn't get anything out of it, I gave to a French steward on the Ile-de-France, who turned out to be a royalist, and after that would not answer the bell when I rang for him. Everybody in Paris, from messenger boys on up and down, is very politically minded and knows lots more than you and I do, or at any rate can talk much faster. I noticed the other day in the Parc Monceau, that loveliest of all green places, a small boy and girl playing Gaston Calmette and Mademoiselle Caillot, the principal figures in the notorious French political shooting of almost 25 years ago. All the little children in Paris play with toy pistols, but they don't play cops and robbers, they play editors and politicians. Now and again a frowning tot of 5 or 6 will toddle to a wall, and with a piece of chalk mark on it, Vive Marais, or Le Soviet Partout, or A bas les 2 ans, or some other slogan of a timely political nature. It is somehow grimmer than the childish gangster hunts in our own parks and corner lots. It is essential to know the names of a few French politicians when you are in France, if only to hold your own in the repartee and invective of the street. For example, if you refuse money to a French beggar, he is sure to shout after you that you are undoubtedly a member of whatever political party he suspects is trying to deliver France into the hands of her enemies. All the political parties are trying to do that, I find, in reading the various Paris papers. In such a case, all you have to do is shout back at your heckler the names of whatever politicians spring to mind. Laval, Daladier, Flandin, Charon. Since all French party leaders are unpopular, even with their own followers, the names of any of them will serve very handily as epithets, and are much stronger than pig, dog, cow, kind of sausage, name of a name, etc. If you are able to bandy the nicknames of the various politicians, so much the better. These nicknames form an important phase of public life in the French Republic, and deserve a paragraph of their own. Almost every one of the 30 daily newspapers in Paris has an editorial writer or two famous for thinking up nicknames for French politicians. Ridicule has for centuries been the strongest weapon of political assault in France, leading virulence by about half a head. And many a man has been ruined, I am told, by an adroitly bitter nickname applied to him by some journalist or political opponent at the proper moment in his career. Once in a while, the people as a whole apply the nickname, France is a race of wags, in which case the malheureux, the poor sap, is likely to be laughed out of public life in no time. Even if he survives, his dignity and importance are forever lessened. Take the case of Monsieur Albert Lebrun. Shortly after he took office as President of France, he posed for the sound reels with his family, which included a tiny grandchild that began to cry as the cameras ground, and the sound apparatus recorded. Monsieur Lebrun bounced the infant up and down on his knee, saying over and over again for all France to hear, "Poo-poo, poo-poo." P-O-O-H in French is P-O-U-H, but it's pronounced the same way. Monsieur Lebrun has been known from that day, from one corner of the Republic to the other, as Poo-Poo. This name will stick to him forever. If he should ever form a cabinet, it would probably be poo-pooed out of existence. What a day it would have been for France when Al Smith called Franklin Roosevelt Old Potato that time, had the two men been French politicians instead of American. The minor pleasantry was lost sight of in America in a few weeks. But a French political figure who had been called Old Potato would have gone to his grave as la vieille pomme de terre. It strikes me as a little disappointing that in a country which devotes itself to thinking up nicknames for politicians as Americans think up nicknames for athletes, there should be so little ingenuity, sharpness, and wit in the invention of them. There is, for example, the case of Monsieur Albert Sarraut, a former premier. In his late 60s, Monsieur Sarraut, according to Mr. Worth, looks something like a village curé, and sometimes like Mr. Pickwick, with an unfortunate platform manner and a verbose, florid style of oratory. You would think the boys would have gouged something pretty funny out of that, but Monsieur Sarraut is known simply as Le Sphinx, after a nightclub of that name in Montparnasse, which he is fond of attending. This was good for a big laugh, however, when he was premier, and is still good for a big laugh. Monsieur Laval is known uproariously as Le Bugnat, which means both a resident of Auvergne and coal and woodman. I understand you have to be French to see the subtle humor of this. Camille Chautemps was long ago damned with the name Le Ténébreux, which means the shadowy one. André Tadieu suffers frightfully under all the dire implications of the shark, and some genius of the boulevards or the couloir thought of calling Monsieur Flandin, who is 6 feet 4 inches tall, Le Gratte-Ciel, the skyscraper. At a meeting he addressed one time, Colonel de la Roche, the Croix de Feu leader, referred to the portly Monsieur Herriot as the fat one, and brought down the House. And so it goes, one laugh after another. This brings us to the actual workings of the French government, to what goes on in the Chamber of Deputies. The Chamber, as everyone knows, is divided into the left, the center, and the right. If you think that you are now about to grasp the nature and composition of the famous French legislative body, you are crazy. Mr. Worth himself, who has for years studied the Chamber of Deputies as correspondent for the Manchester Guardian, has to go into some pretty strange and involved footnotes on this subject in his book. One of them is to this effect. Most of the left Republicans in the Chamber of Deputies do not belong to the left but to the center, and are not really left Republicans at all, but members of the Alliance Démocratique party. Many of the popular Democrats who belong to the right are really left, or at any rate more left than the left Republicans who belong to the center. I have quoted Mr. Worth almost exactly. He made it just a little harder to follow than I have. We must also turn to the invaluable Mr. Worth for an engrossing picture of a French government in action.